Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Portillo. Michael is a British journalist, broadcaster, and former politician. He was elected to Parliament in 1984 and served as Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Secretary of State for Employment, and Secretary of State for Defence under Major. He retired from politics in 2005 and since then has gone into broadcasting. His series include, most notably, Great British Railway Journeys on the BBC. Michael, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, James.
There's plenty of sort of serious topics I want to pick your brain on this afternoon. I'm sure the audience will want to too. But I'm going to start relatively light-hearted and ask about your time in Cambridge. Michael is a Petraean, and you were here in the 70s. And I just wanted to ask, on the basis of your trip up here today and maybe some recent ones, what's changed? What stayed the same about Cambridge?
I don't know. This is partly a voyage of discovery because I think people of my generation are very interested to know whether free speech survives in universities and in Cambridge in particular. And so my visit here is part of a research effort into that. And I might say that when you reach my time of life, you begin to think where you're going to leave your money. And I can't be unique in this respect. And I think a lot of people will be thinking that they would quite like to leave money to their alma mater, but they would only wish to do so if they believed that the traditions of free speech, which they consider to be fundamental to their university education, were being sustained. Yeah. Not so very light-hearted after all.
No, we'll pick up free speech again in a bit, but I've heard a story. I was speaking to my chaplain today. He was a Petraean, slightly, I think he was in the 80s. And he said that there was a custom back then that if members of the college went on dates, their friends would go into their room and take all their furniture into first court and lay it out. And then the bravest would usually sleep in the bed in first court. Was this something you did?
Absolutely. Fundamental part of the education at Peterhouse was the removal of people's bedrooms while they were out. And points were given for the care with which the bedroom was recreated on the lawn. So, you know, the carpet had to be in the right place, and the bed had to be in the right place, and the bedside tables and the lamps, everything had to be in the right place. And as you say, the undergraduates with true style would simply get into their bed when they found it in the middle of the court and sleep in it. I mean, obviously a big change is that we had a lot of single-sex colleges in those days. And I don't think we even had a feeling that they were about to come to an end. That was part of life as it was, indefensible though that is. What I will say, what strikes me most, is that I regard Cambridge as one of the great experiences of my life, although I've been lucky enough to have lots of interesting experiences, but Cambridge, you know, absolutely survives in my mind as one of the most important periods of my life. I look back on it as a fantastic opportunity, and to some extent as an opportunity that I wasted, because when I think about what you have when you're at Cambridge, it would apply to other universities too, but what you have in terms of the people you can meet, whether they're teaching staff or whether they're fellow undergraduates, when you think of the resources you've got in terms of libraries or theatrics or museums, and when I think of how little I made of those facilities when I had them, but perhaps in particular the friendships, you know, there was so many fascinating people here that I didn't know, that I've come to know about since. On the other hand, a very large proportion of the people who are my friends today and that I see all the time are the people I met at Cambridge. The people I met at school and the people I met at Cambridge are the loyalist friend groups that I belong to. You may not be surprised to know more loyal perhaps than those I met in politics subsequently.
You were speaking before we came in here this afternoon how fond you were of your time in Cambridge, but also that I think there's a tendency amongst people at Cambridge to think that their times are unique and the debates that we're having are unique to our time, but you were sort of talking about free speech debates going on somewhat near to the time you were here.
Yes, I mean, now that I remember it, there was great controversy and there could be violence associated with people being invited to speak. And I was slightly surprised that you didn't know about this case, and I don't think you did. But in 1968, and I don't remember the exact details, but Greece was ruled by a dictatorship which was known as the Greek colonels. And I think one of the colonels might have been invited to speak at the Union, but in any case, he was staying at the Garden House Hotel, And there was a riot, and it was led from Peterhouse, Cambridge. Peterhouse. And the students swarmed over the wall and attacked the Garden House. And subsequently, in the trials of the students for disorderly conduct, very severe sentences were handed down by a sort of hanging judge called Melford Stevenson, including extradition for some of the foreign students. I think some of them were Greek, and they were extradited to Greece, where they might have faced God knows what peril, since that was a dictatorship. So it was very much a famous case at the time. And somewhat mysteriously, a few months later, the Garden House Hotel burnt down from top to bottom. The building which is there now has nothing to do with the Garden House that existed in 1968. So that is a rather, I suppose, extreme example of how freedom of speech was contested at the time.
Were you political at university? I mean, did you come to the union?
I joined the Union Society and then never came. I was, I think almost, it cost £12 to be a member, which seemed...
You don't talk about membership costs.
And you see, but this is one of the things I regret, that I didn't come. I was rather shy. Somehow I've lost my shyness a bit since, but I was quite shy, so I didn't. And I didn't join a political association. And this led to a very extraordinary position where, after I'd left, I went and got a job somewhere, which I wasn't very happy with, and I came back to talk to the person that I had most enjoyed being taught by at Cambridge at Peterhouse, who was called Morris Cowling. And I came to ask him for ideas, because I'd found myself in a dead-end job and I didn't know what to do next. And I remember, I quote him verbatim, he said, "Oh, it's a pity you're not interested in politics, because I could recommend you to the Conservative Research Department." I said, "But actually, I am quite interested in politics." "Oh," he said, "well, that's that then, you go to the Conservative Research Department." And you know, that, from that, everything else has stemmed. But there was a word went round at one time, I mean, all this is history now, that Morris Cowling was indoctrinating his pupils in conservatism. I offer my story as proof that he didn't even know what my politics were. It had never come up at any time in the period in which he had taught me.
Yeah, well,
not only did he not know what my politics were, he didn't know I was interested in politics.
Yeah, and clearly you've become rather interested in politics since. So I'm going to...
I was most interested in politics when I was very small. When I was about 8, I came from a family which was very political, because my father was a refugee from the Spanish Civil War, and so there was this great tragedy in the background of my family, that my father's life had been ruined by the Spanish Civil War, that he'd had to leave behind his brilliant career as a university don and his lovely country and his language, because he never spoke English terribly well. So there was this great tragedy, and this was all caused by politics, and it was all caused particularly by extremist politics. My father was a moderate, but nonetheless he might well have been shot had he stayed behind in Spain. So there was my father, who was sort of moderate left. My mother was moderate left as well. We talked about politics in the house all the time. My parents ran Labour Party committee rooms from the house during election days. I had a poster of Harold Wilson on my bedroom wall. And in those days, I knew the name of every minister in the government, not something I've ever known since.
I'm going to pose the same question about politics I posed about Cambridge, which is about change and continuity. Well, I'll do it slightly differently. I think it's clear that some things have stayed the same and some things have changed. Do you think that British politics has got substantively better or worse since you retired in 2005?
Well, I think members of Parliament, because they engage with social media, faced vitriol in a way that we never did, because really the only way that the public communicated with us was by letter. And people by letter were fairly careful about what they said. So I think that is different. Because there's social media, there's vastly more for members of Parliament to do than there used to be, and so they have much larger staffs. So I'm not sure actually that they have to work very much harder, even though there's more to do, because they have these staffs. There was always the pull, even in my day, but I think even more so now, for members of Parliament not actually to be members of Parliament, but to be social workers and to usurp the work of local councillors. I think that has probably got worse. In other words, members of Parliament are more and more apparently judged on whether they're always in their constituencies doing social work rather than whether they make important contributions to the development of national policy. All those trends were already in place. It was already, I think, difficult in my day to get good people to go into politics. In those days, it was because the hours were difficult. But it was always stressful. There was always the possibility of your private life being exposed in a very unhelpful way. I mean, in my day, there were many members of Parliament who were gay and who had to live with that, live with that secret, and must have gone through extraordinary amounts of stress. So, that is something from which we've moved on. So yes, there are differences, but I would say probably there's more that is just the same. And I think the House of Commons, the chamber, is probably substantially the same. And one of the reasons I feel so sorry for the 2019 intake is that since they came in, much of the time the House of Commons hasn't functioned in any recognisable way because of COVID. And I think it must have been terrible for them to go to the House of Commons and not have support systems and not have friends and not have colleagues and not to understand how the place functioned. And there may be some political consequences from this because I've been struck by how many of the 2019 intake seem to be relatively keen on getting rid of Boris, even though it looks to me as though they wouldn't have won their seats without the two Bs, Brexit and Boris. And Brexit isn't going to be a factor at the next election, so they have to ask how will they win their seats next time without either of the Bs, if that's what happens, neither Brexit nor Boris.
I suppose we have to talk about one of the Bs. You are a bit of an in-house expert on Conservative leadership contests. I seem to remember you stood in one once upon a time. Are we going to have a new Prime Minister in 2022?
Well, I don't know, of course, and there's no percentage in trying to guess the future, but I would say that Boris's chances have improved very materially with the passage of time. They've improved mainly because of the passage of time. I think the intervention by the Metropolitan Police, which was extraordinarily cack-handed to postpone the Sue Gray report, means that this thing, goes on for a very long time, and it avoids any moment where there's a decisive outcome, which is the moment when the backbenchers pounce. And while all of this has been protracted, a number of things have happened. I think a lot of the backbenchers have been intimidated, or they might have thought better of their actions, or there's been a failure to gain momentum. And I think the alternative candidates have had a period in which they have been exposed. And I use that word advisedly. I think, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss have been exposed as being, if I may say so, not very impressive. And so all of these things, I think, have operated to Boris's advantage. So I think I would say there was a better than 50% chance of Boris making it.
I'm going to try and draw you and see if you answer, but you don't have to. So I think a lot of I've listened to a lot of your commentary on this, and a lot of it is about realpolitik and political considerations as to why Boris Johnson is going to remain in place. So I suppose my question to you is, that being all well and good, from maybe I can't find the right word, but a moral or an ethical standpoint, do you think the Prime Minister's position is stable?
From a moral or ethical standpoint, is it stable? No, it's clearly not stable. He hangs constantly by a thread, and the reason that he hangs by a thread is because of his moral and ethical position. So, I think that is clear. But, if I can give you my own, for what it's worth, background on Boris, I've always thought Boris the most unreliable person I've ever met. And I'm building here on 25 years of experience. I've been on the speaker circuit for decades. And whenever I went on the speaker circuit, I would say, who was your speaker last year? Oh, Boris. Oh, yes. Tell me what happened. Well, he was 2 hours late and he didn't know where he was and he didn't have a speech. It was all like this. It was absolutely unreliable. And nothing about Boris today is surprising to us. And I was opposed to Boris become leader of the Conservative Party. And I was lucky I had a chat show called This Week, which I was on every week for 16 years. And I took every opportunity to say, in a rather humorous way, that it would be disastrous if Boris became leader of the Conservative Party. But with the Theresa May debacle, suddenly Boris became the only solution to the Brexit issue. And you're probably going to ask me about this in a moment, but I'll preempt you. I made a programme called The Trouble with the Tories, made a documentary in which I interviewed Boris, by the way. And I said, the Conservatives have been beset with this terrible problem for 40 or 50 years, that they're divided on the question of Europe. And even if Boris now becomes Prime Minister, he may do this and he may do that, but he won't manage to settle the problem of Europe in the Conservative Party. Well, he immediately proved me wrong, So you went through that period between July and December of 2019, where he gets rid of all the distance in the parliamentary party, ruthlessly takes away the whip. I assume this was Dominic Cummings' idea. I don't think Boris would have thought of it or implemented, but it was incredibly effective. So he disposes of everyone who disagrees with the policy. He says, let's get Brexit done. He wins the majority of 80. To my mind, this makes him an extraordinary politician. He will go down in history for that 6 months, if for nothing else. And he did get Brexit done. So now I think it is indeed, as you say, realpolitik. If I were a backbencher in the Conservative Party, I would be saying to myself, who is going to win my seat and who's going to win the election for the Conservatives? If Labour keeps Keir Starmer, the opposition is not particularly formidable. But even so, would I count on Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss to beat Keir Starmer? I'm not sure that I would. I don't know that I can count on Boris to beat Keir Starmer. But what I can say is that Boris won a majority of 80, and that before that, Boris won 2 mayoral contests in London. I live in London. It is a socialist city. There are hardly any Conservative seats in Parliament left in London, yet Boris won it twice as a Conservative candidate in the mayoralty. So this man is a formidable election winner. He has this extraordinary charm. By the way, whenever I meet him, whatever negative thoughts I have, I'm immediately overwhelmed by this extraordinary charm. He is a remarkable political figure. And so I think, having spent 20 or 25 years hoping that he wouldn't become leader of the Conservative Party, if I were a backbencher today, I would probably back him.
I want to ask one more question on this, and then we'll move on. I suppose sometimes it's difficult to separate the fact that you were a member of an MP for the Conservative Party and think about the health of British politics more generally. Mm-hmm. The two are separable, of course, Michael. I think a lot of commentators are saying at the moment, or at least asking whether it's healthy for a government to exist for so long, whether they have a sell-by date. This is the 12th year of Tory government now. So my question is, do you think it might be good for a change of government? Do you think it might be good for not only the Labour Party, but the Conservative Party too? They sort of suffer from seem to be suffering from a bit of intellectual fatigue at the moment.
Well, I would much rather answer your question when an election is looming, say in 2 or 3 years' time. I don't exclude the possibility of thinking that it might be time for a change. After all, I absolutely believe that in 1997. 1997, the Conservatives had been in for 18 years, and although I was booted out at that election and lost my chance of leading the Conservative Party and lost my ministerial job and everything went in a moment, I thoroughly believed that the moment had come for a change of government. I was objective enough to believe that. I don't know yet whether I believe that in the present circumstances. And my main reason for doubting that would not be that I see some moral fibre in the Conservative government that you don't perceive, but rather that I'm unsure whether Labour is yet fit for government.
I'll see if we'll leave the audience to see if they want to follow up on that one. But I just want to talk about the sort of elephant in the room, I suppose, which is the events of last night and the reports we're getting today in Ukraine. You were, as I mentioned earlier, Defence Secretary under Major, and we are still facing the possibility of an acute military crisis in Ukraine, depending on how things go, and especially with the news that Putin has sent troops into the eastern part of the country. What's your assessment of what's going on in Eastern Europe at the moment?
Well, I'm so distant from the event, so I don't know that I have an assessment. Let me, as usual, as a politician does, answer a different question. What struck me about what Putin said last night was that he questioned whether Ukraine had ever existed as an independent state. So that takes us away from excuses that he might make about provocations on the border. It takes us away from considerations about whether there are Russian speakers that he can allege are being persecuted. What he said last night was that he doubts whether Ukraine exists independently at all, has ever done so in history, and has any right to do so. And I remember from visiting Kiev, which I did do as Defense Secretary, but more particularly when I went to film in Kiev, because I started looking at the buildings. The religious heart of Russia is in Kiev. The great religious buildings of Russian Orthodoxy are in Kiev. Kiev was a city when Moscow was a village. The origins of Russia were the Kiev Rus tribe, and of course they come from Kiev. So from the point of view of someone like Putin, and I dare say a great tranche of the Russian people, there is no distinction between Russia and Ukraine. And what has happened in the last 30 years is entirely anomalous. That Ukraine's independence is not a reality. It is important for us to understand this, but in my view, not important for us to condone it. But therefore, I'm worried that this is not, as some people think, just an incursion, that it will go further. And I mean, obviously, I would lament enormously the loss of Ukrainian independence. I would lament enormously the loss of blood and the economic warfare and cyber warfare and all the other warfares that will go on between the West and Russia will also be extremely damaging to all parties. But I very much fear that Putin does believe that this is the manifest destiny of Russia and his own manifest destiny to reunite Ukraine and Russia. And I don't think we'll be able to do very much about it. You did ask for my perspective as Defense Secretary. I had very good relations with my opposite number in Russia. Now, this was an interesting period because the Soviet Union had collapsed a few years before, and we were busy inviting into NATO those countries that had been under the Soviet yoke, so Poland and Romania and Bulgaria, and so on. And I could tell that the Russians found this a humiliating process. Again, I don't condone. The reason that Poland and Hungary and so on rushed to join NATO was that they understood Russian aggression and Russian imperialism. They had lived under it. I mean, recall that these people were entombed in their own countries with barbed wire, and that people who tried to cross the barbed wire were shot dead for wanting to go and live in the West. So, Russia, of course, cannot complain about NATO aggression. All these countries have joined NATO voluntarily, and they've done it because they have a genuine and well-founded fear of Russian imperialism and Russian aggression. All that having been said, we never contemplated, nor could we ever contemplate, making Ukraine a part of NATO, because there was no way that we were going to commit ourselves to going to war with Russia over Ukraine. And this is an awkward thing, because although it's a reality, and it's evident from what we've not said over the last 25 years, it does come pretty close to recognizing a Russian sphere of influence, which is why it's uncomfortable, why we don't want to say it. But, it was perfectly perceptible to us 25 years ago that Ukraine was vulnerable, and vulnerable in a way that wasn't going to lead us to go to war with Russia.
I think I'm going to ask one more question, and I'm going to open up. And it concerns another one of your sort of strong convictions that is well known. It's your Euroscepticism. And I wanted to ask a question about that through Ukraine. I posed the same question to Lord MacDonald, who was the former Deputy Secretary of the Foreign Office. He came last week. And I asked him basically what Ukraine says about the EU as a geopolitical actor, about its functionality, about its cohesiveness in the face of threats. And I think we've seen that the European Union has struggled to deal with Putin because it hasn't got a consistent line, but also with the CCP and China. So I just wondered whether, given recent events and since we've left since the vote to leave in 2016, your Euroscepticism has changed, softened, hardened.
My Euroscepticism has definitely hardened. But I mean, to give you a little bit of history, there is a cohesive, and there certainly was a cohesive organisation, which is called NATO. And the countries met within NATO, and we talked seriously about threats to our security. And we talked about, what forces we had to deploy, how much money each country ought to be spending on those resources, and we did joint exercises, and we set up joint headquarters and so on. So this was, this was a real organisation. I don't say it would always have been effective if put to the test, but it was a real organisation. But then around that, you had the French, who of course pulled out of NATO in 1960, and who wanted to have a European security and a European foreign policy which did not involve the United States. It was essentially anti-Americanism. And so there was a great deal of grandstanding about establishing a European foreign policy. Well, how is this European foreign policy to be established? What, by majority voting? I mean, can you imagine either France or the United Kingdom accepting a foreign policy which had been foisted upon it by majority voting? I mean, this was always a completely unrealistic proposal, to which, of course, the French response was, well, what we need is more Europe. We need ever closer European integration, and when we've got a single European state, then we'll have a single European foreign policy. Well, I didn't want a single European state, and the reason I didn't want it was that I thought it would not be democratic, and I didn't think it would be accountable. And so, the chaos that has ensued here over Ukraine is not, to me, surprising. But, it does raise some very interesting questions. I mean, why exactly are the British people being told that they mustn't develop any oil fields in the North Sea and they mustn't frack any gas, when the European Union is taking possession of a new pipeline from Russia to become dependent on gas? What? I thought we were all moving to green policies, and here's the European Union importing lots of gas to burn and making itself wholly dependent on Russia. And to boot, the Germans have decided to do away with nuclear power, which is a carbon-free energy source. So they've made themselves vulnerable to this position. I mean, I find this extremely frustrating. But to understand the nature of the European Union, I would ask you to look at what's going on in Northern Ireland. I mean, with the most extraordinary heaps of hypocrisy. The European Union said that the Northern Ireland Protocol would observe the Belfast or Good Friday Agreement in all its aspects. Well, it obviously does not, because it puts a border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland in the Irish Sea. It is clearly destabilising the politics of Northern Ireland. It is clearly making the unionist population believe that they're about to be sold out in some way. It is absolutely unacceptable that people who are in part of the United Kingdom should not have access to goods that are produced in Great Britain, which are destined for Northern Ireland and not destined for the European Union. And as the political structures that were established in the Belfast Agreement, like the Northern Ireland Executive, as they collapse under the pressure of the Northern Ireland Protocol, the European Union remains indifferent and aloof to what is going on. And it is this terrible, unaccountable authoritarianism of the European Union, which we saw before when they destroyed the economy of Greece, having introduced the single currency. And that is why I'm so relieved that we're not part of the European Union. Unfortunately, we haven't yet put ourselves in a position where we don't suffer from the European Union. But if you want to see how the European Union bullies, have a look at what it's doing to Northern Ireland today.
I'm going to take that as your Euroscepticism hasn't softened.
Correct.
I'm going to open up to the audience now. So if you just stick your hand up and I can get a microphone to you. Just here first, please. Thank you, David.
Hello, my name is Phil Seeley. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I spoke to a few family members and friends about you coming to speak here, and a lot of their words describing you were loyal, in politics at least. Loyal, sometimes too loyal. And so I was asking if you thought that quality was still present in politics today, and whether that was something that you thought could still be treasured in politics in the years to come. Thank you.
Your family members are very generous. I'm afraid to say, I mean, I've been loyal in some ways. I've been loyal to friends, I think, but I was not thought to be, well, you see, I certainly wasn't a supporter of John Major, in whose cabinet I was. And so if John Major were here, he would certainly say that I was disloyal. In fact, he publicly described me as a bastard, you may remember. So, and if he were in the audience, he would be extremely surprised by your question. And I dithered, actually, because there was a time in 1995 when John Major decided that he would resign the leadership of the Conservative Party and then stand in the election that followed. And in fact, he invited me and he told me to my face, he said, it's the first news I had of it. He said, oh, Michael, I'm going to resign the leadership and then I'm going to stand to be the leader again. And I had a split second, that long, to decide whether to say, well, in that case, Prime Minister, I'm going to stand against you. Or, well, in that case, Prime Minister, I support you. And, I sort of heard the words coming out of my mouth, well, well done, Prime Minister, I'll support you. But I was in a very undignified position. It was easily the least happy period of my career, the least distinguished period of my career. And I've been quite amused in a way to see Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss in a very similar position. How do you express loyalty to the leader while making it perfectly clear that you'd be happy to take over if they had an accident, along the way? So I'm surprised by your question. But, loyalty would be lovely. But actually, I think James came up with the word earlier. It's realpolitik. And we mentioned a person called Maurice Cowling, who taught me at Cambridge. And if you go to the library, he wrote a book called The Impact of Hitler. By the way, it's the impact of Hitler on the Labour Party, which is rather interesting. But read the first few pages of that book, which is about the character of high politics. It's about how high politics is really about 100 people at most, and the way they interact with each other, and the things they do to impress one another, and the things they do in order to forestall one another. And Morris, who'd never been in politics, I don't know how he understood it that well. But those few pages repay reading if you want to know what it's about. And I can hear him saying the character of high politics. It's about this 100 people and how they interact. That's what it's about. And I'm afraid loyalty, it doesn't get much of a look in, I don't think.
I'm just going to play devil's advocate on that high politics point, though. If you look at mass membership party politics today and the way that the Labour Party functions, do you think it's tenable to say that, it's just the 100 men and women at the top that make a difference now? Do you think that's one of the things that changed in politics? Or do you think, high politics is just a truth that transcends context?
I think it is still true. Of course, you could trip me up with all sorts of little differences. And by the way, the pages don't say it's only the 100 people. For example, he mentions the importance of the press. And so, of course, translating that into the present world, it would be media of all sorts. So, of course, that's recognized as part of the package. But no, I think it does remain true that it's about 100 people. The 100 people is, fairly constantly changing. But these are the people who really decide the fate. And they're always looking to party political advantage. Of course, they're also looking to the interests of the state and the good of the people and all those things, but because they believe that they're, best for all those things, that if they're in power, it's best for the people, it's best for the nation's interest, because they think that they are the best, of course, national interest and party political advantage are intricately bound up. The two things are not divisible in these people's minds.
Another question.
I'm one of the fascinating people you didn't meet as an undergraduate. Probably because I was hanging around the union and you weren't. Many years later, I heard you say that we overestimate how much power is concentrated. This follows on from what we've just been talking about. But that power is much more diffuse than we think it is. Now, thinking back, my impression was that under Margaret Thatcher and John Major, we did have cabinet government. We didn't seem to have much of it under Blair, and I wonder quite what we've got today. So my question is power more concentrated, number 10, for example, or is it still as diffuse as you said?
If I recall the remark I made, it was to say that I never felt personally powerful. You know, people say if you're in the cabinet, you're in power. And it wasn't something I ever felt. And why didn't I feel it? Because for me to do something, to carry forward what I wanted to do, I had to convince so many people along the way. You know, I probably pretty much needed to convince my civil servants that I needed to carry the issue in cabinet, then I needed to convince the press that it was a reasonable thing to do, then I had to defend it in Parliament. And, you know, at no time in that long process did I feel powerful. I felt that, you know, the whole thing was a great struggle. And, you know, in the end, if I got 60% of what I wanted, that might be quite a good result. I was not in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet, but I was in John Major's cabinet. And I was saying to James over lunch, I've already alluded to the fact that the Conservative Party was torn apart by the European issue. I believe the cabinet only once discussed the European issue, and that was very late on, just as we were going up to the election in which we were destroyed. The Prime Minister made sure the cabinet did not discuss the most important issue that was confronting all of us. So, you know, talking of elephants, there was this enormous elephant in the room. So I wasn't hugely impressed by cabinet government when I was in the cabinet. And as for what it was like under Margaret Thatcher, well, different people would say different things. I mean, Michael Heseltine, of course, was deeply unimpressed by cabinet government under Margaret Thatcher, and he walked out of the cabinet one day and then, of course, contested the leadership, and although he didn't get the leadership himself, he managed to bring her down. Now, your question about concentration of power, Margaret Thatcher was a powerful prime minister. I'll just give you a tiny example, but when I was a junior minister, I had this idea that there was the Susie Lamplugh case, I think it was. A young woman had probably been abducted and probably murdered. And this gave rise to the idea that minicabs should be licensed because a woman was getting into a car and she didn't know who the driver was and so on. So I had this idea of licensing minicabs because I was persuaded by the Susie Lamplugh Trust. But Margaret Thatcher had a constituency in Finchley which was full of taxi drivers. And one day I was walking, minding my own business, through 10 Downing Street. And she must have had the door ajar. She came rushing out of her door like a trapdoor spider. And I had managed to get a hand on the banister. I was going upstairs. And she put her hand on mine and stopped me in my tracks and said, I hear from my taxi drivers that you're thinking of licensing minicabs. My taxi drivers object because taxi drivers thought it would give respectability and they would lose their monopoly. And I said, well, Prime Minister, yeah, I was thinking, and she said, stop it. And that was it. I went back to my department and I said, this policy is finished. So she did have power like that. And we were debating this over lunch. I suspect that the Boris and Prime Minister since are barking up the wrong tree. I think by having Downing Street absolutely filled with staffers and special advisors probably makes Downing Street less powerful. It was a very slimline organisation when I was there. It essentially consisted of civil servants. Margaret Thatcher had a big aversion to special advisors. She was so conventional. She wanted to do everything by the book. And so, you know, essentially there was to be the government who were elected and there were to be civil servants who were there to implement the government's will. And she didn't understand these people who were neither fish nor fowl. And so she worked exclusively through the civil service. I mean, can you believe that our press officers and our departments were all civil servants? And they might be completely useless, but we were not allowed to fire them because they were civil servants and there were civil service processes for appointing, you know, all officers, including press officers. Can you imagine that a government operated with this level of disadvantage? But I suspect that she was probably more powerful because now you have so many people in Downing Street who have a sense of entitlement, including an entitlement to pontificate and to brief the press and so on, that I suspect number 10 is less powerful for having so many of them.
Hi. One of the things I really admire about you is the range of things you've done in government and outside of government. And I remember about 10 years ago, I saw you on TV and you said something along the lines of, each year I've tried to live my life better than the year before, and by and large I've managed to succeed. Just about 10 years later, I just wanted to know if that's still the case and how you might have achieved that, and whether actually changing jobs and changing what you do has been a big part of how you've managed to do it.
Thank you so much for remembering that I said that. Yes, that my ambition had been to make each year better than the year before, and I'd succeeded. Yes, I think I have continued to succeed in that personal ambition. And it's curious, isn't it? Because, you know, before I had much more power, and I was more important, and I was in headlines and so on, and yet somehow I've got happier as time's gone by. I think partly it's the aging process. I mean, I told you that when I was at Cambridge, you know, I was too shy to go to the Union, and I've lost my shyness along the way. And you do lose a lot of inhibitions of all sorts as you go through life, and that makes you more relaxed. I mean, very obviously, although I loved politics, it was immensely stressful. Immensely stressful. You know, when I think of some of the things I was dealing with and the way your enemies were always after you, I'm talking about people in your own party, of course. The Labour Party were perfectly friendly. You know, all of that was very, very stressful. And so part of what has happened to me is that I've gone into less stressful things. So, for example, making my railway journey programmes is not stressful. And a lot of people enjoy them, not generally speaking people the age of the people in this room, generally older people enjoy them. And so I get a lot of satisfaction out of that. And also, yes, I've been changing some of the things I've been doing. So recently I've been doing a show on Times Radio. And this is entirely about sort of personal development, but it requires me to read 2 or 3 books a week and to talk to thoroughly interesting people every week. So that's terribly nice. And recently I've been doing some presenting for GB News. Well, I've never had to do presenting before with an earpiece stuck in my ear and reading the auto cue and trying to stop things, you know, going horribly wrong as they tend to. So that's been a new challenge. So yes, I just relish all these new challenges. I've become so bold, I come to the Cambridge Union.
Thank you. Back to boring politics, but thanks so much for your thoughts. I just wondered, there was a phrase that came out of the pandemic, the Great Reset, and that was talked about a lot of the time, not so much at the moment, but it was sort of reflected in Biden's sort of greater state intervention and so on. And it's been reflected to some extent in Boris's policy, and Lord Frost has been very critical of it. But do you think it has any longevity as a sort of maybe a 10-year sort of electoral strategy for the Tory party? Does it reflect a shift in political culture in this country? Or do you think it's something that mainly came out of the pandemic and doesn't have much of a lifespan?
I've only just, I think, got onto the word Great Reset. Yes. Is that what you said? The Great Reset. I haven't thought much about the Great Reset, but I doubt whether there's very much in the Great Reset. I don't perceive very strongly that we're coming out of the pandemic very different from the way we went in. I think we're just about to begin an enormous debate about what the pandemic means and what lessons we should learn. And I think this will be a very, very important debate. There's a fellow called Professor Woolhouse who's launched one of the first pieces of ammunition in the war. And his position is basically that we should have closed our borders faster, but that essentially lockdowns were the wrong thing to do. And that it was certainly the wrong thing to believe that you could eliminate COVID, that what you had to do was move as quickly as possible to living with COVID. Now, these questions, I think, are really important. And at a global level, we're involved now in an enormous competition between the democracies and the authoritarian regimes in general. Because since the collapse of the Iron Curtain, where the democracies were in the ascendant, gradually, year by year, the authoritarian regimes have reasserted themselves with much greater confidence, And they make a pitch to the world, the authoritarian regimes, in which they say, you don't want liberty, you don't want freedom of thought. What you want is economic growth, what you want is efficiency, what you want is infrastructure, and this is what authoritarian regimes give you. Look at China, 6% growth a year, railways everywhere, airports everywhere, economic growth, fantastic. Don't worry about political liberty. And, even in this country, some people are attracted to this, but certainly in the Middle East, in South America, a lot of people are attracted by this. There is a serious competition. And part of it now is going to be about the aftermath of COVID. I mean, who was right? Was China right to follow a zero COVID policy? They've not had so many deaths. Or were we right? We've had a lot of deaths, but we are restoring our liberties. How will China ever get out of its zero COVID policy? I don't know how it ever emerges from it. So I think there's a huge battle still to play out on this between the authoritarian regimes and the democracies, and indeed between authoritarians and libertarians in our own country. Perhaps one of the reasons why I don't think we're ready for a Labour government is I don't like the way Labour was always in favour of additional restrictions, day after day, whatever the circumstances. So I don't think it's a reset. I think it's a new battleground.
They were government policies, though. So I wonder if you think that the battle in the party that you belong to, who's winning that one between the authoritarians and the libertarians, as you put it?
Well, recently the libertarians have been winning. I mean, we would have gone into a pre-Christmas lockdown had it not been for the fact that 100 Conservative backbenchers rebelled on COVID passports. And that is when Boris lost his nerve. But I'm afraid the nature of Boris is it's all about who makes him lose his nerve. I mean, the reason I did read a good article on this, and I think it was probably by, is his name Dominic Lawson? I think it was probably by Dominic Lawson, in which he said, the reason that Boris got into Partygate was that Boris never believed in the restrictions. He was bullied into the restrictions. And one of the ways, you may find this very odd, but I perfectly understand it, one of the ways he dealt with this psychologically was to show his own personal contempt for the restrictions that he'd introduced. So he wasn't actually going to live through them and with them and by them himself. And that, of course, has got him into an appalling amount of trouble. I now do a morning programme on Sundays with Arlene Foster. Very interesting talking to her. She was First Minister of Northern Ireland at the time. And she said, you can't imagine how we were bullied by the medical people, by the committees, by the civil servants. They said, First Minister, this is the advice we offered you. It's on the record. You can go with it or you can go against it. But if you go against it, there will be a public inquiry and you will account for why you made a decision that went contrary to the advice that we were giving you. That's almost blackmail. That is appalling pressure. Now, if that was going on in Northern Ireland, I'm sure it was going on in England as well. And that's why I think, Boris introduced restrictions he didn't believe in and then didn't stick by them. So the point I was making was, I'm afraid, Boris tends to do whatever thing he's bullied into. And recently, the best bullies have been the Conservative libertarian backbenchers.
Thank you very much. My name is Sasha, and I'm really grateful to be here. I'm really a follower of your cultural stuff in the media. And just a naive question, maybe the most naive question today. Do you speak your father's language? And if Spanish had any influence, any impact in your future career? Thank you. Gracias.
De nada. I may have missed part of the question. The influence of my father's heritage and Spanish heritage on me, is that broadly the question? Yes. It's difficult to know how to answer this because, when I go to Spain, I strike people as very British. Although, when I get there, I travel out on the Spanish passport. The Spanish passport is in the name of Miguel Portillo. I try to speak Spanish. I speak reasonable Spanish, but not excellent Spanish. But, my Spanishness is really important to me, So, my wife and I bought a house in Spain. We now have a tremendous community of Spanish friends. I have about 30 Spanish first cousins. Of course, they all now have any numbers of children. And I'm quite a good organizer, actually, so I am a convener of my family. So I very often organize reunions of my cousins in Spain. I can be quite sentimental about this. So, for example, on what would have been my mother's 100th birthday, I summoned the cousins to the town where my father was born, which is Madrigal de las Altas Torres, which was the village from which Isabel la Católica came. So the family descended upon my father's birthplace for a tremendous party. So I'm quite sentimental about this, and I now spend a long weekend every month in Spain, and that is very important to me. So I find it hard to say exactly which bit of me is Spanish. I can have a short temper, carácter, as the Spanish would say, and I think I inherited that from my father, who could have quite a short temper. But it's very important to me. And just before someone asks, but how can you be a Eurosceptic then if you have a Spanish passport and you have an intimate knowledge of another European country? I say precisely for those reasons, precisely because I do not believe that two peoples with such wonderful cultures, but such distinct cultures, and I don't just mean cultures in a cultural sense, I also mean political cultures. I do not see how two such diverse nations with such splendid histories can possibly be governed in common. There is no way in which you can establish a democratic space and a democratic accountability in which these two countries can be governed in common, which is what the European Union was aspiring to. So I would say it is precisely my intimacy with Spain that makes me a Eurosceptic, contributes to my Euroscepticism. And I know, when I go to Spain, people can't understand, or most people can't understand, my being a Brexiter. But that's also because, Spanish people lost their democracy. And they don't really have very strong belief in their institutions because they didn't survive. They were all crushed by dictatorship. And so, of course, they want to be part of a European Union which they think guarantees them peace and guarantees their institutions and provides a superstructure which will hold their institutions up, even if they're not strong enough to survive themselves. And if the Spanish think that, then the Portuguese think that, and the French do because they were defeated in the Second World War, and the Germans do because they did terrible things, and the Italians do. But the British don't, because our institutions weren't crushed during the 20th century. They survived. And you can't do away with this difference of perspective. It is so fundamentally important.
It's just gone 5-2. Should we do 2 or 3?
Yes. You've got to go to cricket, but I'm relaxed.
It's not true.
Which one?
Just here.
Good afternoon. Very much enjoying your talk so far. Thank you. My name is Ross Buckingham. I'm going to admit, actually, I'm one of those people that watch your railway documentaries. I actually am a teacher in Prague now as a consequence of watching your Continental railway programs, which I very much enjoyed. While my surname and my accent would suggest otherwise, I'm actually Northern Irish, and it was very interesting that we've mentioned Northern Ireland a number of times already. Looking back on what has happened and come to pass over the past couple of years in particular, do you wonder if the implications are there in terms of moving towards a united Ireland at some point in the future? Do you think that process, if indeed you think it is going to eventually take place, do you think that process has speeded up or slowed down as a consequence of what has come to pass in recent years? Thank you.
Although I am a Brexiter, I've also recently, I've been very lucky in this, I've been doing a number of documentaries about Irish history on the centenaries of the Easter uprising, on the centenary of the Civil War, the centenary of the War of Independence, the centenary of the creation of the Northern Ireland border. And this year, I will make a film about the centenary of the Irish Civil War. And I began the sentence saying, although I'm a Brexiter, I'm afraid the absolute constant theme through Irish history is that the British do not understand Ireland, don't care much about Ireland, don't factor Ireland into their decisions. And Brexit is an example. Ireland was not factored into the British consideration of Brexit. Well, of course it wasn't, because it was a referendum, and people weren't asked in that referendum to consider the consequences for Northern Ireland. However, I think there is a perfectly doable deal between the European Union and the United Kingdom if the European Union were willing to do it. And the British have put it forward. I mean, it's essentially a traffic light system. So goods that are passing from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, they're going to stay in Northern Ireland at Tesco's or Sainsbury's or wherever, pass through a sort of green channel, and stuff that is headed on to the Republic goes through a red channel, or even stuff that we don't know about because it's not a trusted trader who's involved in that trade every day of the week. Even that stuff goes through the red channel. But you normalize life. That's all perfectly doable. But of course, what has happened has stirred up Northern Ireland. And the other day, there was a gathering of 10,000 people showing their emotion. We forget now that there were riots in Northern Ireland until the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. They stopped the day of the death of the Duke of Edinburgh, which is significant because it shows that they were organised, because it was possible to stop them. Just so if it was possible to stop them, it must have been because they'd been started. So there's a great deal of instability in all of this. There's the short-term possibility that Sinn Féin might become the largest party in Northern Ireland after the elections. And as I understand it, the unionists have not accepted that they would necessarily form an executive in which Sinn Féin was the largest party. And the argument I've heard is it's not so much the job of the First Minister they're worried about, it's the job of the Justice Minister, which goes to the largest party, and the unionists cannot accept that a former terrorist would be the Justice Minister. And there is another thing in prospect, which is that there may one day not very far away, a Sinn Féin Taoiseach, because Sinn Féin, I think, in the last elections was the largest party in the Republic. So Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil got together to keep Sinn Féin out, but you can't necessarily do that in perpetuity. You can't continue to keep out the party that gets the most votes again and again. And a Sinn Féin Taoiseach in the Republic surely would begin to push the question of a border poll. I think for as long as the Republic is under either Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil, the last thing the Republic wants is a border poll. I mean, can you imagine the Republic of Ireland having to absorb 1 million Protestant unionists who don't want to be part of that country? I mean, it's a recipe for disaster. But a Sinn Féin Taoiseach would not see it in that way. So yes, I am quite worried about the possibilities of instability. I can't say, how it will all turn out, but you can see how one thing leads to another.
Hello, thank you for coming to speak. I live in your former constituency, Enfield Southgate. I was just curious, what you spent a long time in politics, and all politicians change and modify their views, especially when they are part of a number of high offices. I'm interested, was there any moment in politics, or period in politics, or indeed person in politics, who changed your view or modified your view on what the good society should look like, or a just society?
Well, you probably might expect me to say that the most impressive person I met in politics by far was Margaret Thatcher. And why did she impress me? Because of all the prime ministers I've known or known of, she was the only one who had an idea what she wanted to do with the job. Most people who become prime minister exhaust all their energy in becoming prime minister and get there and have no plan, and she had a plan. But what was also quite impressive about her was that she was willing, she knew her destination, but she was willing to tack towards it. She was much more of a tactician than most people give her credit for. I think we've just passed an anniversary of the calling off of the miners' strike of 1981, in which I was intimately involved. I was in the Department of Energy at the time. She wasn't ready for a miners' strike in 1981, and so I was in the room when she told us, I was in the Department of Energy, as I've said, she told us to go and buy off the miners whatever the expense. We weren't ready for a strike. So she was someone who was very, very tactical. But I think she did have a view of a good society. Many people disagreed with that view and disapproved of that view, and it's interesting that she is hated until this day. But she really did believe in people. She really did believe in releasing people's energy. She believed in, removing barriers. She believed in encouraging people to do their best. And many, many people benefited and flourished under her government. Not everybody, that is true. But I don't remember a period in which there was such opportunity, such belief that whoever you were, you could be whatever you wanted to be. And to an extent, I was an example of that. I was a grammar school boy. I didn't have any particular expectation of getting to Cambridge. I certainly didn't have an expectation of getting into the cabinet. But my own autobiography is not particularly important. It's just that there were millions of people like that who in that period felt that they could be whatever, well, there was no limit to what they could be.
Thank you for talking here today. Out of your 16 years of this week, I was just curious as to know the most memorable guest you had.
Yes. You'll have to help me with this. Who is the lead singer of the Pogues?
I'm not too sure.
Shane MacGowan. Thank you. Shane MacGowan was the most memorable guest. So Shane MacGowan was the lead singer of the Pogues. And we were on very late at night, so he was brought into the studio at about, midnight. And it was clear that he'd had a very heavy evening. And he was brought in by two people, and he was put onto the sofa. And I have a memory of him as a somewhat egg-shaped man anyway. And he kind of swayed on the sofa like this. And I could see disaster looming for the program. And in fact, I could see people in the sets going like this, because it was going to be this appalling disaster. And the presenter that evening, most exceptionally, was not Andrew Neil, but Janet Street Porter. And the debate was, can you believe this, that the Irish Republic had introduced a ban on smoking in pubs and so on before Britain. And the question was, whether this could possibly work. And so Janet asked Seamus McGowan this question, Shane McGowan, to which he said, and I quote verbatim, he said, and Janet Street Porter said, come on, Shane, that won't do as an answer. Answer my question. To which he said, and I quote verbatim, and at some point he said, Gardaí, which I recognise as the Irish word for police. And I said, I'm afraid the story is rather to my credit, but I was determined to save the programme. I leaned forward and I said, but Shane has made the vital point. And I saw Shane look surprised, and I saw Janet Street Porter look surprised. And I said, of course, it's all about whether the police will actually enforce the ban. That is the big question. And we just about survived the evening, but he was certainly my most memorable guest.
Michael, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. Thank you. It was really enjoyable. Thank you very much. I'm going to go quickly run and make sure there's a taxi for you to get to the station, but I'm sure if there's people who want to meet you, then you've got 5 minutes.
Please, James. Thank you very much. I've got a telly programme to go to, so that's why I need to rush. But thank you very much. You've been a lovely audience. Thank you so much.